You can, I suppose, make a utilitarian justification for obnoxious practices. You could make a utilitarian justification for torture. If you accept abortion at all, then aborting because you've been diagnosed by an amniocentesis of having a Down syndrome child is surely not a worse reason for aborting than aborting just because you feel like it.
Good day, my Christian friends. I am Dr. Frederick Mulder. I've got a passion to encourage and equip Christians who are battling under the burden of progressive or liberal theology. And today I'm tackling one of those big giants, those elephants in the room, and that is Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, the philosophy surrounding that, and how racism was endemic to Darwinism and empire builders. And if you read someone like Richard Dawkins, you will never hear about that. You only hear about Christians and what they've done. And we know, yes, Christians have been complicit in racism and all sorts of wrong things. But today I want to dig into this whole issue of racism within Darwinism. And I think the main reason I felt it's necessary to do it now is there's a famous biblical scholar in England who's the head of a theological college, and he recently on his Facebook said, "Happy birthday to one of my heroes, Charles Darwin." And then I decided to respond. I felt that I've read enough over a couple of years. For a couple of years I did not really focus on this. I'm not a scientist, I'm a biblical scholar, I'm a church historian, but I thought that the time is now right to speak about this and really unpack some of it. So today is going to be a mouthful, and before I proceed any further, just a couple of initial observations. Number one, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and the philosophy surrounding that is like a huge elephant. You can't eat it up, you can't dissect it in one go. So this is the first conversation of probably several. Number two, I am not part of the Black Lives Matter movement. Ironically, I think they are perpetuating some of Darwin's theories with abortion and so many black babies in America that has died. So they are just continuing part of that paradigm. Number 3, I'm going to try and give us an overview of some things that I think we have not really looked at over the past couple of years. I'm going to focus in on the way in which Charles Darwin has been used at Oxford, in specifically Cecil John Rhodes. And then I'm going to try in this whole picture that I'm going to paint for us, I'm going to intersect with missionaries. Cecil Rhodes was annoyed and frustrated with missionaries constantly throughout his endeavors in Africa. Number 4, there are so many books that you can look at. I have looked at a couple. This one is by Anthony Thomas. He's from Cambridge. And this is a biography of Cecil John Rhodes. I don't agree with him on everything, but lots of source material in here that is very helpful. I've looked at this book from Philip Ziegler, Legacy of Cecil John Rhodes and his Rhodes Scholarship. Then I have also looked at A.N. Wilson's Charles Darwin, Victorian Mythmaker. Again, I don't agree with everything. He will be critical of me because I'm a conservative Christian. But there are loads of things in here I think that is uncomfortable and that critical scholars and Darwinians should really take seriously. Now, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give us just a brief overview or introduction from Darwin, the impact his work had in Oxford, and then I'm going to go to Southern Africa where Cecil Rhodes came into the picture. I'm going to interrupt the conversation when I reach some of the missionaries. I'm going to go back to the anti-slavery movement within Christianity. I'm going to go back, finish with Cecil Rhodes, and then after that try to unpack the legacy and then missionary work, and finish with a couple of quotes and a surprising concession of an atheist that visited a mission station in Southern Africa a couple of years ago. So I hope you're ready. Here we go. So one of the key foundations of Darwin's theory in The Origin of Species is the idea that nature is everlastingly at war and that evolutionary progress happens by conflict. Now, a couple of years later, in The Descent of Man, 1871, there was another edition, 1874, he specifically said, civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. Page 105. Now, to understand how Charles Darwin's theory became dominant in Oxford and Cambridge, it was at a time when the new Prime Minister was Disraeli, and the idea of empire became quite popular. You had the European powers who started to expand and use their technology to conquer parts of the world. And you had a very famous, most famous art critic of the Victorian era at Oxford University. And in 1870, it was Professor John Ruskin. And listen to this excerpt from his inaugural lecture and see how that fits into empire and Darwin's theory. There is a destiny now possible to us, the highest ever set before a nation to be accepted or refused. We are still undegenerate. We are still undegenerate in race, a race mingled of the best northern blood. Will you youths of England make your country again a royal throne of kings, a sceptred isle, for all the world a source of light, a centre of peace? This is what England must either do or perish. She must found colonies as fast and as far as she is able, formed of her most energetic and worthiest men, seizing every piece of fruitful waste ground she can set her foot on, and there teaching these, her colonists, that their chief virtue is fidelity to their country, and their first aim is to advance the power of England by land and sea. Now, what is crucial to understand, shortly after this, Cecil John Rhodes started his studies at Oxford University from 1873 to 1878. He also received an honorary doctorate. And I want to read for us a piece from Cecil Rhodes' Confession of Faith in the wake of his Oxford studies. He says, "I contend that we are the finest race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. If God does exist, he must be working to a plan. Therefore, if I am to serve God, I must find out the plan and do my best to assist him in its execution. How to discover the plan? First, look for the race that God has chosen to be the divine instrument of future evolution. Unquestionably, that is the white race. Whites have clearly come out on top in the struggle for existence and achieved the highest standard of human perfection. Therefore, I shall devote the rest of my life to God's purpose and help him to make the world English." And later on, he had a secret society where he also worked behind the scenes to further the empire. We'll also later see the Rhodes Scholarship that put actually into practice that desire to build out the empire. Now, as I've said earlier, I'm not going to go into chronological detail with everything. I'm going to focus in on a couple of key moments that I found that is crucial to understand how Cecil Rhodes thought, how he used evolution, how he discriminated, and how that brought a kind of a I don't care attitude towards the natives and people that he felt was in his way for building this empire. One interesting example was the outbreak of smallpox. And as you will know, smallpox is incredibly dangerous. It is contagious. People have to be quarantined. There was an outbreak in South Africa and quarantine was implemented all over the country. But at Kimberley, where Rhodes was mining, they did not follow the procedures. And they wanted to maintain the operations and not get their turnover to go down, of course. And 751 people died. The doctor who was in charge discovered what was going on. And then there were all sorts of fraud going on where pink slips were handed out in the neighboring towns where boys distributed a letter from the doctor saying this is not smallpox. And when somebody confronted Cecil Rhodes about it, saying people are dying, he shouted at them and said, "It is not smallpox, it is chicken pox." Now the next story gripped my heart, and this is where the missionaries come in. And as I've said, some missionaries unfortunately did participate in this evil. They were bought by Rhodes, but there were some he could not buy. And we're going to talk about one of them right now. And that was in 1885, the Reverend John Mckenzie. He was from the London Missionary Society, and he was the deputy director of Bechuanaland. It's in the north of South Africa and parts of Botswana. And he stood up for the rights of the Africans. And guess what happened? Mckenzie was sacked, and who was appointed in his place? Cecil John Rhodes. And Anthony Thomas rightly argued in this book persuasively that Rhodes was a constant critic of Christian missionaries. Why? They stood in the way of his empire. The missionaries believed that all races were created in the image of God. They are all equally valuable to God. And that was a problem for Cecil John Rhodes. Now, with that in mind, let's just briefly look at the history of missions in southern Africa. So the first missionary that we know about was in 1737 from the Moravians in Germany. You had George Schmidt. He started a mission station at Genadendal. He baptized some slaves, and then he was sent away because when they were baptized, they could not be slaves anymore. That was the first missionary movement that we found in the Cape. Then a very interesting one, not often acknowledged, a Dutch Reformed Church pastor, H.C. Vos. He had a call for ministry. He went to Amsterdam, studied, came back. He wrote a letter to the Dutch Missionary Society and also the London Missionary Society in 1797. And then they sent 4 missionaries from the London Missionary Society, one of which was J.T. van der Kemp in 1799. Then you had the 1820 British settlers, of course, who came in. And then you had more movement where they wanted to come and give rights to the Africans, anti-slavery. You had J. Phillip. Later you had Robert Moffat, who went to Kuruman. And eventually here there was a big breakthrough for these missionaries when in 1828 Ordinance 50 was approved. And that gave equal rights to the Khoisan people in the Cape. So there was no discrimination against them, and that was for them a great celebration of rights for these indigenous communities. You will also know that in 1834 slavery was outlawed in the British Empire, and of course the names of Wilberforce, Buxton, they were the pioneers who used scripture to argue that we are all created in the image of God. Now what is crucial to keep in mind historically is that all of this happened before Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, The Descent of Man, before Rhodes, before the empire. Now let's go back to Rhodes' story and finish the picture, and then we'll finish off later with the missionaries at the end. Then we go to De Beers Mining, 1888, the Charter Company in 1889. The background story is just absolutely remarkable. If you want to read that, Anthony Thomas's book will be fantastic. It's just extraordinary how he was able to buy people's favor. From the left, from the right, missionaries. It's just absolutely a terrible story of how the Charter Company and De Beers was approved in England. He was even able to get Queen Victoria behind him, but there were all sorts of fraudulent activities going on in order to get all of these companies going. Now in 1893, Lobongula, he was the king of the Matabele. When Rhodes planned to invade Matabele land, he used a technique that Hitler later used by creating a skirmish and then using that as an excuse to invade. And thousands of Matabele was slaughtered by Rhodes and Jameson and his men as they entered the country, and he misused the Bible. Go read Luke 14 verse 31. That's the verse that Cecil John Rhodes sent off to Jameson, and then they invaded. Now by 1894, Rhodes was Prime Minister in the Cape, and then he introduced what can only be regarded as a racist apartheid policy, the Glenn Gray Act. And let me read for you, I'm quoting how he argued this policy in Parliament. He described it as a native bill for Africa and his favourite child. Rhodes said, "My idea is that the natives should be kept in these native reserves and not mix with white men at all." Now there's much more we can say about it, but let me read for you a paragraph from Anthony Thomas where he tries to describe the racism that you found in Cecil John Rhodes. If anyone can be accused of laying the foundations of apartheid, it was the most English of Englishmen, Cecil John Rhodes. In 1887, 61 years before the nationalists came to power in South Africa, he had stood before a packed House of Assembly in Cape Town and declared, "These are my politics on native affairs, and these are the politics of South Africa. The native is to be treated as a child and denied the franchise. We must adopt a system of despotism such as works so well in India in our relationships with the barbarians of South Africa." 7 years later, Rhodes drew up his blueprint for a new South Africa. Far from being the economically illogical legacy of the frontier, the creation of Afrikaner nationalism, this was an English plan, devised by English capitalists who had made and were continuing to make their fortunes from South Africa's diamonds and South Africa's gold. Nothing to do with the Afrikaners here, and this is not me, this is an Englishman writing this, Anthony Thomas, using Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, the survival of the fittest, as the foundation for Cecil John Rhodes' racism in the Cape Parliament. And then you will know the Boer War. My dad likes to call it the English War. 1899 to 1902, and we know that around 28,000 women and children died in concentration camps. Hitler later used that same method with the Jews, although there are obviously differences between that. We think at least 16,000 black people also died in concentration camps. And now this is now one of those crucial phases where we need to just take a pause to see the legacy of Rhodes. And I've looked at this book with his last will and testament in here. He died the same year that Queen Victoria died. And I think what is crucially important to understand the dominance, I believe, of Charles Darwin theory in higher education globally, I believe can be traced back to the Rhodes Scholarship System of Cecil John Rhodes. Why do I say that? In his last will, most of his fortune was placed in this will. He donated to Oxford University, University of Cape Town, and so forth. But most of his money, his blood money from De Beers and the gold, was put in this fund. And in here he describes it in detail. More than 20 scholarships per year for 3 years, all going back to where? Oxford, where he studied. And what happened? You have generation after generation of scholars that were invited, and the criteria is remarkable. I mean, they had to be the cream of the crop to qualify for this scholarship. They had to be things that Rhodes never was. So he selected the cream of the crop from the empire, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, America, later on Germany as well, from the Commonwealth. And they were invited to come to Oxford for 3 years. They get a stipend. It was plus minus £300 per year. That works out in today's money more or less £35,000 a year. In South African rand, it's almost 700,000 rand a year for 3 years. And they do research at Oxford University. Now, if you go back, 1902, 20 scholars. 1903, 1904, 5, 6, and those scholars go back all over the world, and the focus of attention is on Oxford, 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 all the time. So can you see that the secret plan of this English empire and the philosophy behind what Rhodes did were just perpetuated and sent all across the globe? Now, let's just quickly finish our overview. Then you had an interesting phase. After the war, you had the Peace of Vereniging. And this is very crucial to remember. The English, given their history of anti-slavery, could have insisted on the native issue to be dealt with and sorted out. They didn't. Alfred Milner, close companion of Cecil Rhodes, was appointed. And he had a group of more than 10 Oxford students. They were called the Milner Kindergarten, and they worked on the Union of South Africa. They did not challenge the Glenn Grey policy. And remember, eventually in 1913, you had the Land Act that discriminated against black people. And who was in charge? Who was in the department that approved it? J.W. Sauer. Who was he? He was the brother of the smallpox doctor, Dr. Sauer, who was bought by Rhodes as well. So can you now see what's going on here? You have Rhodes's men placed at strategic positions to safeguard De Beers, the mining work, discriminating against black people, all in the name of Rhodes's scholarship and his philosophy based on Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, how can I say this? One example. 1916, Saul Platje. He went to London to petition against this Land Act. A couple of years after, he was unsuccessful. They didn't listen to him. And South Africa stayed under the British Crown until 1931. So I think it is reasonable to infer from all of this that all of these things go back to the legacy of Rhodes and how Rhodes used Darwin's theory of evolution, the survival of the fittest, to build his empire. And it was not done in the name of Jesus or the Bible. It was done with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. And Cecil Rhodes implemented it by force. Now let's go back to the missionaries. Now I want to tell you a story that is extremely close to my heart, and that goes back to the Anglo-Boer War again. And what happened, more than 15,000 Boers were sent to concentration camps. St. Helena, you had about 6,000 Boers. In India, there were 2 camps. In Sri Lanka, there was a big camp. And what happened, you had a number of pastors who preached to these Boers. At St. Helena, you had Reverend Lowe. In India, you had a Reverend Burgers, Reverend Viljoen, and then you also had some pastors in Sri Lanka. You had ministers who preached to these Boers. Most of them lost their farms. 28,000 women and children died. And here you had these men, miserable, depressed, disease, with English captains. And these pastors nurtured and prayed, and they sang psalms. And guess what happened? Around 200 of these Boers converted. And when they returned in 1903 to South Africa, they decided not to go back and rebuild their farms. They went to Wellington to a mission institute started by Andrew Murray, a Scottish minister who came to South Africa, his father and the famous Murray family. They got training to become missionaries, teachers, doctors, and they got these qualifications to be missionaries. And where did they go? They went to Zimbabwe and Malawi to mission stations, schools, hospitals, Christian education. And now I want to finish with that surprising story I told you about an atheist who I met. I gave him a lift in Cambridge. I'll never forget it. I picked him up, took him to the train station. He was late, and that day I could also share with him my story. And his name is Matthew Paris, famous atheist. He was MP earlier, and he writes for the Times. And he visited Malawi. A charity, Water Aid, took him out where they have clean water pumps installed in communities. And I just want to share a couple of excerpts from his story with you. Matthew Paris, as an atheist, I truly believe Africa needs God. Traveling in Malawi refreshed another belief, one I've been trying to banish all my life, but an observation I've been unable to avoid since my African childhood. It confounds my ideological beliefs, stubbornly refuses to fit my worldview, and has embarrassed my growing belief that there is no God. In Africa, Christianity changes people's hearts. It brings a spiritual transformation. The rebirth is real. The change is good. Whenever we entered a territory worked by missionaries, we had to acknowledge that something changed in the faces of the people we passed and spoke to. Something in their eyes. The way they approach you direct, man to man, without looking down or away. It would suit me to believe that their honesty, diligence, and optimism in their work were unconnected with personal faith. What they were was, in turn, influenced by a conception of man's place in the universe that Christianity had taught. Not Darwin's theory of evolution, Christianity had taught. Christianity, post-Reformation and post-Luther, with its teaching of a direct, personal, two-way link between the individual and God that connects with made in the image of God, unmediated by the collective and insubordinate to any other human being, offers something to hold on to those anxious to cast off a crushing tribal groupthink. My friends, has Charles Darwin's work not become a crushing tribal groupthink that has caused so much pain and suffering, the survival of the fittest, in contrast to what the Bible teaches us. I want to wrap up today and show you how Darwin's theory has become a religion. I'm going to play you a little clip from a famous professor who's an agnostic or an atheist from Yale University to illustrate what has happened over the past couple of decades.
When I look at their intellectual behavior, what they publish, and much more important, what they tell their students, Darwinism has indeed passed beyond a scientific argument as far as they are concerned. You take your life in your hands to challenge it intellectually.
Yes.
They will destroy you if you challenge it. Now, I haven't been destroyed. I'm not a biologist, and I don't claim to be an authority on this topic. But a book review is not the same as a book. It's sort of a satellite around the book. Anyway, it remains the case that I have nothing personally to charge my colleagues with. But what I've seen in their behavior intellectually and at colleges across the West is nothing approaching free speech on this topic, is a bitter rejection, not just a sort of bitter, fundamental, angry, outraged, violent rejection, which comes nowhere near scientific or intellectual discussion. I've seen that happen again and again. I'm a Darwinism. Don't you say a word against it, or I don't want to hear you, period.
Which proves that you're attacking their religion, in effect.
I am attacking their religion, and I don't blame them for being all head up. It is a big issue for them, unquestionably.
I want to finish with a quote from Ian Wilson. Darwin offered to the emerging Victorian middle classes a consolation myth. He told them that all their getting and spending, all their neglect of their own poor huddled masses, all their greed and selfishness was in fact natural. It was the way things were. The whole of nature, arising from the primeval slime and evolving through its various animal forms from amoebas to the higher primates, was on a journey of improvement, moving onwards and upwards, from barnacles to shrimps, from fish to fowl, from orang-utans to silk-hatted members of parliament and leaders of British industry. Think of Cecil John Rhodes. It was all happening without the interference or tiresome conscience pricking of the Almighty. He, that is God, in fact, had been conveniently removed from the picture, as had the names of the many other thinkers and scientists, including Darwin's own grandfather. For all the brave Darwinian talk of natural selection being non-purposive and impersonal, it breathes through the pores of everything which Darwin and Darwinists write, that natural selection in fact favors white middle-class people, Western people, educated people over savages. After nearly 150 years of thinking about these ideas of Darwin's theory of evolution, many human beings have come to recognize that such sudden realizations of the truth are often indications of collective psychology. Huxley was like the bulldog for Darwin. Huxley and the other Victorians who leapt at the idea of the survival of the fittest as the explanation of everything did so for other than scientific reasons. We can see that now. My friends, is it not time to abandon Charles Darwin theories of evolution and the philosophy and the empire and the racism that it's been used for? Is it not time to return to a more secure foundation that we have been made in the image of God, and that God has spoken and he is not silent, and he calls you and me to spread the good news of Jesus Christ in this broken world. thank you so much for listening today. I know that was a mouthful, and there's so much more to be said. Thank you for watching today, and may the Lord Jesus Christ bless you. Until next time, goodbye.